evening, survivors. This is Alex Reed with Station 103.7, your voice in the darkness, broadcasting live to bring you stories from the edge of humanity. Tonight's broadcast takes us somewhere unexpected, a place where the worst of humanity was meant to be locked away for good, but now something far more horrifying roams within those walls. This is Ridgeway Penitentiary, a fortress designed to confine chaos, but now overwhelmed by it. Imagine a structure so imposing, it feels like the walls themselves are alive, pressing in on those inside. Built from thick, weathered stone and reinforced steel, Ridgeway was meant to be impenetrable. Its high towers and barbed wire fences gave it the appearance of a fortress that no man could escape. But tonight, the danger isn't breaking out. It's spreading within. It started with one, a single infected inmate brought back to Ridgeway after what was described as a violent altercation during transport. What should have been routine quickly became the stuff of nightmares. Guards monitoring the intake area first noticed the unusual symptoms: sweat pouring down his face, eyes glazed over, and almost mechanical jerking in his movements. Before they could react, he lunged. His strength was inhuman, his hunger insatiable. The infection spread faster than anyone could comprehend. A bite here, a scratch there, and suddenly Ridgeway was no longer a prison. It had transformed into a living nightmare. Picture the chaos. Guards shouting orders that were drowned out by screams. The deafening clang of cell doors slamming shut, desperate to contain something that couldn't be contained. Inmates, once defiant and uncooperative, now huddled in terror as the infected roamed the halls, their relentless growls echoing off the cold stone walls. Ridgeway's intricate system of control, its schedules, routines, and protocols crumbled in a matter of hours. What's striking about this story isn't just the horror of the outbreak, but what happened next. Ridgeway became an unlikely battleground where the lines between right and wrong blurred. Guards and prisoners, once sworn enemies, found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder, fighting to survive. It was no longer about authority or rebellion. It was about staying alive. Imagine a guard handing a weapon to an inmate he once considered irredeemable, trusting him to hold the line against the infected. Imagine a prisoner risking his life to pull a wounded officer to safety. In moments like these, humanity's true nature, its capacity for both unity and sacrifice, was laid bare. But survival wasn't just about courage. It was also about strategy. Those who made it through the first night had to adapt quickly. They learned to stay silent in tight spaces, knowing the infected were drawn to sound. They reinforced barricades with anything they could find: desks, beds, even pieces of ripped-out plumbing. Duct tape and cardboard became makeshift armor to protect against bites. These weren't soldiers or survivalists. They were ordinary people, some of them criminals, doing whatever it took to endure. And yet, the fear was palpable. The infected weren't mindless. Survivors reported seeing them mimic human behavior, calling out for help in distorted, unnatural voices to lure their prey. This wasn't just a virus. It was something far more sinister, something that turned the very essence of humanity into a weapon. As the hours dragged on, a glimmer of hope emerged. A group of survivors stumbled upon a map of the prison's old utility tunnels, a labyrinth of forgotten passageways buried deep beneath the prison. These tunnels were their best chance for escape. But there was a problem. The infected had already begun to infiltrate those narrow, suffocating spaces. Imagine the dread of knowing that freedom lay just beyond a corridor filled with creatures waiting in the dark. Tonight, I'll take you deeper into the story of Ridgeway Penitentiary. You'll hear about the survivors who defied the odds, the sacrifices that were made, and the moments of sheer raw humanity that stood out amidst the carnage. This isn't just a story about zombies. It's a story about us, about what we're capable of when the world falls apart and all that's left is our will to survive. But before we move forward, I want to leave you with this question. What would you do if you were there? If you were trapped inside those towering walls with no one to trust and nowhere to run, how far would you go to protect yourself and the people around you? Think about it. Because as this story unfolds, you might find that the answers aren't as simple as they seem. Stay tuned, survivors. There's more to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Ridgeway Penitentiary was built to hold the worst of humanity. Tonight, it holds something far worse. Part 1. Setting the scene. Prison environment and main characters. Ridgeway Penitentiary stood like a monolithic fortress, a grim testament to the lengths society would go to contain its darkest elements. The walls were an intimidating 30 feet of reinforced concrete, weathered by decades of storms and stories, stained with streaks of rust and grime. Barbed wire curled atop the perimeter like a crown of thorns, shimmering menacingly in the daylight and blending into the darkness at night. For those inside, these walls weren't just barriers, they were a declaration. Escape wasn't an option. The prison's architecture was deliberately oppressive. Narrow hallways, just wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder, created a constant sense of claustrophobia. The air was perpetually stale, tinged with the metallic scent of iron and the faint, lingering bitterness of disinfectant. Cells lined the corridors in neat, unfeeling rows, small, windowless cages where time seemed to stretch endlessly. Each door bore scratches and dents, a silent testament to years of frustration and hopelessness. Every step echoed through the halls, a reminder that in Ridgeway you were never truly alone. Even before the outbreak, tension brewed like a storm within these walls. Guards patrolled the corridors with an air of authority, their heavy boots announcing their presence long before they arrived. They carried batons and pepper spray, tools meant to maintain order, but often wielded to assert dominance. On the other side were the inmates, men and women hardened by years of survival, in a world that had already cast them aside. For many, Ridgeway wasn't just a prison, it was a proving ground where strength and cunning were the only currencies that mattered. Conflicts between guards and inmates were a daily occurrence. A guard might confiscate a contraband item, a handmade shiv, a packet of cigarettes, or a crude communication device, and spark a cascade of resentment. Inmates formed alliances for survival, dividing themselves into groups based on shared backgrounds or common enemies. Trust was scarce, and betrayal was a currency traded as often as cigarettes. Ridgeway wasn't just a prison for criminals, it was a battleground where every day was a fight to maintain control, order, and survival. The tension, however, extended beyond the obvious factions of guards and inmates. The warden, Gerald Knox, was a man burdened by the weight of his position. A veteran in corrections, Knox prided himself on running Ridgeway with an iron fist, believing that strict discipline was the only way to maintain order. His presence was commanding, his voice deep and measured, but behind his calm exterior lay a man constantly fighting battles against the prison budget, against the growing mistrust of his guards, and against the unspoken fear that he was losing control. Among the inmates, a handful stood out, each carrying their own burdens and secrets. There was Leon Shade Carter, a quiet man who had become a reluctant leader among his peers. Shade had earned his nickname for his uncanny ability to disappear into the shadows, both figuratively and literally. Despite his criminal past, he was respected for his wisdom and unshakable calm, qualities that made him the de facto problem solver in his block. Shade wanted nothing more than to keep his head down and survive his sentence, but fate had other plans. Then there was Miguel Torres, a wiry and resourceful loner with a knack for finding solutions in impossible situations. Miguel was the kind of person who could turn a pile of junk into a functional tool or weapon. His hands were always busy. his mind always calculating. While others dismissed him as a harmless tinkerer, Miguel had a sharpness to him, a sense of awareness that suggested he was always thinking 3 steps ahead. Lastly, there was Darren Wildcard Jones, a volatile and unpredictable presence. Darren was a man driven by impulse, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. He was the kind of person who thrived on chaos, often creating it for his own amusement. Yet, beneath his brash exterior, there was a hint of something deeper, a pain he rarely let surface. Darren was a dangerous ally, but in the chaos of Ridgeway, danger often came with a strange kind of reliability. On the other side of the spectrum was Officer Samantha Hayes, one of Ridgeway's most experienced guards. Hayes was a steady presence in a sea of instability, a woman who carried herself with quiet strength. While many guards viewed the inmates with disdain, Hayes treated them with a begrudging respect, understanding that empathy could often achieve more than force. She had seen it all during her years at Ridgeway, the fights, the riots, the heartbreak, and yet she remained a voice of reason, bridging the gap between prisoners and staff. The uneasy equilibrium of Ridgeway was a delicate dance, held together by a mix of fear, authority, and reluctant cooperation. But this fragile balance was about to be shattered. The events that would unfold would force inmates and guards alike to question everything they thought they knew, about themselves, about each other, and about the walls that had always kept them apart. The storm that would consume Ridgeway Penitentiary began as nothing more than a ripple, a single, seemingly contained incident that no one realized would escalate into a nightmare. It started in the intake area, a sterile, high-security wing of the prison designed to process new arrivals. On any other day, it was a place of routine, of paperwork and procedures, but today it became the gateway to chaos. The inmate arrived late in the evening, escorted by 2 transport officers who seemed eager to unload him and move on. His name wasn't important. What mattered was the condition he was in. He was disheveled, his orange jumpsuit torn and stained with something dark and sticky. His wrists were shackled, but his hands twitched violently, his fingers clawing at the air as if searching for something unseen. Sweat poured down his face, and his eyes, clouded and unfocused, darted wildly around the room. The guards on duty exchanged uneasy glances. Something about him wasn't right. One of them, a younger officer named Patel, approached cautiously, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "Transport log?" Patel asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. One of the transport officers handed over the paperwork with a curt nod. "He's your problem now? Good luck." Before Patel could ask any more questions, the transport officers turned and left, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. Patel flipped through the paperwork, his frown deepening. The inmate had been picked up after a violent altercation at a nearby facility, but the details were vague. The only note of significance was a single word scribbled in the comments section: unstable. Patel's unease grew as he watched the inmate. His movements were erratic, his breathing shallow and rapid. When Patel motioned for the man to be taken to a holding cell, the inmate suddenly lunged forward, his chains rattling as he snarled like a cornered animal. It took 3 guards to subdue him, and even then, his strength seemed unnatural. By the time they secured him in a cell, the tension in the intake area was palpable. Within an hour, the inmate's condition worsened. He began thrashing against the walls of his cell, his body convulsing in violent spasms. His guttural screams echoed through the corridors, drawing the attention of other inmates and guards alike. Those who witnessed it later described the scene as something out of a nightmare, his body contorting in ways that defied logic, his eyes rolling back into his head until only the whites were visible. Then, just as suddenly as it began, he fell silent. The guard stationed outside his cell hesitated, unsure of what to do. One of them, a seasoned officer named Richards, muttered, Probably passed out. Let him cool off. But the silence didn't last. Moments later, a low, guttural growl emerged from the cell, sending a chill down Richards' spine. He turned to his partner, a rookie named Larson, and whispered, "Stay back. I'm checking it out." Richards approached the cell cautiously, peering through the small, reinforced window. What he saw made his blood run cold. The inmate was no longer convulsing. Instead, he was standing perfectly still in the center of the cell, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes now completely white, locked onto Richards with an intensity that made the veteran guard take an involuntary step back. Then it happened. Faster than anyone could react, the inmate lunged at the door, slamming into it with such force that the hinges groaned under the strain. Richard stumbled backward, shouting for Larson to call for backup, but before the rookie could respond, the inmate's strength proved too much. With a deafening crash, the cell door burst open. The infected inmate was on Richards in an instant, his teeth sinking into the guard's neck before he could even raise his baton. Blood sprayed across the walls as Richards let out a gurgled scream, his hands clawing desperately at his attacker. Larson froze, paralyzed by fear as the scene unfolded before him. The commotion drew the attention of nearby guards, who arrived just in time to see the infected inmate tear into Richards with a ferocity that defied comprehension. Shouts filled the air as batons were drawn and orders were barked. But nothing seemed to slow the infected down. It took a shotgun blast to the chest to finally bring him down, but by then, it was too late. Richards lay motionless on the ground, his lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. The guards stood in stunned silence, their weapons still raised, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Then, without warning, Richards' body twitched. A low, guttural growl escaped his lips as his fingers began to curl into claws. The infection had spread. Panic erupted as Richards rose to his feet, his movements jerky and unnatural. He turned on his former colleagues with a hunger that was both terrifying and tragic. The guards fought valiantly, but the infection spread faster than they could contain it. Every bite, every scratch added another infected to their ranks. The chaos wasn't confined to the intake area for long. The infected quickly spread to other parts of the prison, their snarls and screams echoing through the hallways. Inmates, initially unaware of what was happening, soon found themselves trapped in their cells as the infected stormed through the corridors. Some screamed for help, while others banged on their cell doors in desperation. Within hours, Ridgeway Penitentiary was unrecognizable. What had once been a place of order, however tenuous, was now a battleground. Guards and inmates alike were forced to make impossible choices: fight, flee, or fall. The towering walls that had once provided security now felt like a cage, trapping them inside with a threat far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. And this was just the beginning. Part 1. Survivor Stories and Emotional Appeal. Focus on human drama. In the chaos of Ridgeway Penitentiary, survival brought out unexpected alliances, forcing individuals to see past roles and labels. It wasn't just about prisoners or guards anymore. It was about who could be trusted to stand and fight. Leon Shade Carter had always been a man of instinct. He kept his head down, avoided unnecessary conflict, and chose his battles carefully. But as he crouched behind an overturned table in the infirmary, listening to the guttural growls of the infected prowling nearby, he knew this wasn't a fight he could avoid. Across the room, Officer Samantha Hayes was pinned against the wall, her leg trapped under a collapsed medical cart. She was injured and weaponless, her baton lying uselessly out of reach. The infected, a hulking, former inmate whose body bore the twisted signs of the virus, bulging veins, discolored skin, and unnerving jerky movements, had already locked onto her. Hayes tried to pull herself free, but the weight of the cart and the pain in her leg made escape impossible. Her breaths came in short, sharp gasps As the infected lumbered closer, its distorted face twisting into something inhuman. Shade could have stayed hidden. It would have been the smart thing to do. But something about Hayes' struggle stirred something in him. A memory of someone he couldn't save. A debt he felt he owed to the universe. Without thinking, he grabbed a piece of broken piping from the ground and lunged out of his hiding spot. "Hey!" Shade shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The infected turned its head sharply, its movements unnervingly fast. It let out a guttural snarl and charged toward him. Shade braced himself, gripping the pipe tightly as he swung with all his strength. The impact sent the infected staggering backward, but it wasn't enough to bring it down. "Move!" Shade shouted at Hayes, his eyes darting to the cart pinning her leg. With a grunt, Hayes pushed against the cart, finally freeing herself, but the infected was already recovering. Shade knew he couldn't hold it off much longer. Just as it lunged again, Hayes grabbed her baton and delivered a crushing blow to the side of its skull. Together, they fought it off, their makeshift weapons delivering blow after blow until the infected finally collapsed in a heap. Shade leaned against the wall, panting as Hayes looked at him, with a mixture of shock and gratitude. "Why'd you do that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Didn't feel like letting you die today," Shade replied, his tone casual. But his eyes betrayed something deeper. In that moment, the invisible line between prisoner and guard blurred, replaced by a shared determination to survive. Elsewhere in the prison, the weight of survival pressed heavily on Officer Larson. After the initial outbreak, he had done what many might consider unthinkable. He ran. The screams and chaos overwhelmed him, and his thoughts turned to his family. He left his post, fighting through the pandemonium to reach the exit, but when he finally made it to the gates, guilt stopped him in his tracks. He couldn't shake the image of his fellow officers fighting for their lives, the people he had sworn to protect being overrun. He knew he couldn't face his family, knowing he had abandoned them. Larson turned back, re-entering the prison as the sounds of battle echoed around him. He wasn't a fighter by nature, but the thought of redeeming himself pushed him forward. When he stumbled upon a group of inmates fighting off the infected in the cafeteria, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed a discarded baton and joined the fray, his strikes clumsy but determined. The inmates, initially suspicious, soon realized he was there to help. Together, they drove the infected back, securing the room as best they could. "You could have left," one inmate said, his voice laced with disbelief. "Why'd you come back?" Larson didn't have a good answer. "Because running didn't feel right," he admitted. The room fell silent for a moment before one of the inmates clapped him on the shoulder and handed him a makeshift weapon, a table leg reinforced with duct tape and nails. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. In another part of the prison, Miguel Torres and a small group of inmates stumbled upon the armory, its heavy steel door hanging open. Inside were shelves of riot gear, batons, and enough firearms to turn the tide. Miguel's eyes scanned the room, calculating. They could defend themselves now, maybe even fight their way out. But the question loomed. Should they share the weapons with the guards? Darren Wildcard Jones, leaning casually against the doorframe, voiced the thought everyone else was thinking. Why share? They wouldn't hesitate to leave us to rot. Miguel hesitated, his fingers brushing against the barrel of a shotgun. We can't do this alone, he said finally. The infected don't care about uniforms. If we don't work together, none of us are getting out of here. Darren snorted. Suit yourself. Just don't come crying to me when they turn on us. Despite the tension, Miguel made his choice. He carried the weapons to the surviving guards, his voice steady as he explained the situation. We fight together, or we all die here, he said simply. The guards exchanged wary glances, but eventually they nodded in agreement. In that moment, alliances were forged not out of trust but out of necessity, As the hours wore on, the lines between inmate and guard blurred even further. In the face of a common enemy, they began to see each other not as adversaries, but as fellow survivors. The bonds that formed in those desperate hours would be tested, but they would also become the foundation of their fight for survival. The desperation outside Ridgeway Penitentiary was as palpable as the chaos within. Families of the guards, staff, and even some inmates clung to faint hopes of hearing from their loved ones. As the outbreak spread and communication lines faltered, Station 103.7 became a beacon for those seeking answers. "This is Alex Reed," the broadcaster began, his voice steady but somber. "We've received messages from families desperate to know what's happening inside Ridgeway. They've called in, left voicemails, even written letters. A mother pleading for news of her son, an inmate serving a 5-year sentence, a wife asking if her husband, a guard, has made it through the night. To all of you listening, I wish I had better news. What I do have are stories, fragments from survivors inside those walls. Tonight, we share their voices because their survival is proof that hope can endure, even in the darkest moments." The broadcast paused, the crackle of static filling the silence, before a recorded voice broke through. It was shaky, panicked, yet resolute. A survivor calling in from within the prison. "My name is Miguel Torres." The voice began, breathless and hurried. "I don't know how long I have before they find me, but people need to know. The infected, they're not just mindless. They learn. They mimic us. I heard one. It sounded like a man crying for help, but it wasn't. When I got close, His voice cracked, the memory too fresh to articulate. He took a deep breath and continued. "Don't trust what you hear in the dark. And if you're still alive, then cover yourself. Use anything. We've been taping magazines and cardboard around our arms and legs. It's not perfect, but it saved lives." The recording ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Alex Reed's voice returned, softer now, as though addressing each listener directly. "Miguel's warning is clear. The infected adapt. They exploit our humanity, our instincts to help, and they turn it against us. But his advice, it's simple, effective, and might just keep someone alive." As the broadcast continued, Alex shared more survival tips that survivors inside Ridgeway had devised. They were ingenious in their simplicity, born from necessity and desperation. Inmates had discovered that duct tape, when layered with scrap metal or thick materials, could create makeshift armor capable of deflecting bites. Plastic trays, once used for serving meals, were repurposed as shields. Even bed sheets, soaked in water, were wrapped around exposed skin to provide a temporary barrier. "Stay silent in tight spaces," Alex advised, echoing the survivors' warnings. "Sound carries in those hallways, and the infected are drawn to it. If you must move, do so carefully. And remember, these aren't just tips, they're lifelines." The broadcaster's voice faltered slightly, betraying a hint of emotion. "To the families listening, I wish I could give you certainty. But what I can give you is this, the knowledge that people are still fighting inside those walls. They're making choices that go beyond survival. They're protecting each other, risking everything, for the chance to see another sunrise." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "For those inside Ridgeway, if you can, hear this. Know that your stories are being told. Your courage is not lost in the shadows. And for those listening on the outside, ask yourself this. If it were you trapped in there, who would you fight for, and how far would you go to save them?" As the broadcast ended, the haunting reality of Ridgeway lingered in the minds of listeners. The prison was more than just a battleground. It was a crucible of human resilience, where every decision carried the weight of life and death. And while the infected were relentless, so too were the survivors who refused to give up. Part 1, Rising Tension. Survivor Strategies. Inside Ridgeway, survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about thinking ahead. The group of survivors, a mix of inmates and guards, found themselves huddled in the cafeteria, the largest space they could secure. The tables, once bolted to the floor, had been pried loose and stacked against the entrance to create a makeshift barricade. Chairs were piled high, forming a second line of defense. Despite their efforts, it all felt painfully inadequate. The infected were strong, relentless, and growing in number. Miguel Torres crouched near the barricade, his eyes scanning the room for anything else they could use. Supplies were limited, and ingenuity was their only weapon. He turned to Officer Hayes, who was wrapping duct tape around her arms to reinforce her protection. "We need more than this. If they break through here, we're done." Hayes nodded grimly, her hands trembling as she worked. "The infirmary's got better doors, but it's across the courtyard. We'd never make it without a distraction." Shade, who had been silently observing, spoke up. "We don't need to make it. We need to split them up, divide their attention. If half of us hold here, the rest can move supplies to the infirmary. That gives us 2 safe zones." Darren Jones smirked from his perch near the kitchen counter, his arms crossed as he leaned against a wall. 2 safe zones, huh? Or 2 death traps. You really think the doors will hold if they figure out how to push together? Shade's eyes locked on Darren's. "You got a better plan?" Darren shrugged, his grin fading. "Nah. Just don't want to be on the losing side when this all goes south." The tension between them was interrupted by a low growl outside the barricade. Everyone froze, their breath caught in their throats. Miguel motioned for silence, his hand tightening around a crowbar. They waited, the only sound the faint shuffling of feet and the occasional snarl. The infected were close, but for now, the barricade held. As the group debated their next move, Miguel pulled out the map he'd found earlier in the armory, a worn, yellowed blueprint of the prison. He traced his finger along the lines until he found what he was looking for. "The utility tunnels," he whispered. "They run under the cafeteria and lead to an old maintenance hatch outside the walls. If we can get down there..." Shade leaned over the map, his expression skeptical. "And how do you know those tunnels aren't crawling with infected?" Miguel didn't look up. "I don't. But staying here isn't an option. We need to find a way out before supplies run out, or before they figure out how to tear this place apart." Hayes studied the map, her brows furrowed. "The entrance to the tunnels is in the basement. That's at least 3 hallways away. If we go, it has to be fast and quiet." Shade nodded. "Then we split up. Miguel and I will check the tunnels. Hayes, you stay here and keep the barricade secure. If we don't come back in an hour..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The group reluctantly agreed. Shade and Miguel armed themselves with whatever they could find, a crowbar, a broken chair leg, and a small flashlight with barely any battery left. As they slipped out through a side door, the air in the cafeteria grew heavier. The remaining survivors whispered prayers, their eyes darting to the barricade every time a sound echoed from the other side. Shade and Miguel moved swiftly but cautiously through the hallways, the dim emergency lighting casting eerie shadows on the walls. The infected could be anywhere, and every creak of the floor sent a chill down their spines. When they reached the basement stairwell, they paused. The door to the stairs was ajar, its hinges bent as though something had forced it open. Miguel peered through the crack, his flashlight illuminating the descending steps. "It's too quiet," he muttered. Shade tightened his grip on the crowbar. "Too quiet's better than too loud. Let's go." The descent into the basement felt like entering another world. The air was damp and heavy, the walls slick with condensation. The faint hum of machinery echoed around them, masking any sounds the infected might make. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Miguel spotted the entrance to the tunnels, a rusted metal hatch embedded in the wall. He moved toward it, but Shade grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Wait," Shade whispered, his eyes scanning the room. Something wasn't right. The hatch was partially open, its lock broken and hanging loose. There were scratch marks around the edges, as though something or someone had forced it open. Before they could process the implications, a low growl echoed from the tunnel beyond. Shade turned off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. He motioned for Miguel to stay silent as the growl grew louder, accompanied by the shuffling of feet. The infected were already in the tunnels, and there were more than they could handle. Shade held his breath as the sound of shuffling feet grew closer. The darkness was their only ally, but it also amplified the terror. Miguel's grip tightened around the flashlight, his knuckles white. He was desperate to switch it back on, but Shade's hand on his arm reminded him that light could mean death. The growls echoed from deep within the tunnel, a chorus of hunger and rage that made the air feel thicker. Shade motioned for Miguel to back away slowly, his movements deliberate and soundless. They retreated toward the stairwell, each step feeling like a gamble. As they reached the base of the stairs, a sudden clang echoed from the tunnel. Both men froze, their hearts pounding in unison. The infected weren't just wandering aimlessly. They were testing the boundaries, pushing objects, learning the space around them. Shade's earlier fears solidified. The infected were getting smarter. He pulled Miguel closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to warn the others." Miguel nodded, and together they crept up the stairs, their ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The ascent felt endless, each creak of the metal steps threatening to give them away. When they finally reached the hallway above, they bolted, abandoning stealth in favor of speed. Behind them, a guttural snarl erupted, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The infected had found their trail, back in the cafeteria. The tension was at a breaking point. Darren paced near the barricade, his agitation growing with each passing minute. Hayes, still tending to her injured leg, kept a watchful eye on him. "You're gonna wear a hole in the floor," she said, her tone sharp but tired. Darren shot her a glare. "You think sitting here is gonna save us? They're out there right now figuring out how to tear this place down." "And what do you suggest?" Hayes snapped, running into the arms of the infected. "Be my guest." Before Darren could respond, the side door burst open, and Shade and Miguel stumbled in, their faces pale and their breaths ragged. "We've got a problem," Shade said, slamming the doors shut behind them. "The tunnels are full of infected, and they're not just wandering. They're coordinated." Hayes' eyes widened. "Coordinated? What does that even mean?" Miguel leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. "They're testing things, pushing objects, listening. It's like they're figuring out how to get to us." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Darren broke the tension with a nervous laugh. "Great. Smart zombies. Just what we needed." Shade ignored him, turning to Hayes. "We need to reinforce this place now. If they figure out how to get through those tunnels, they'll be on us before we even see them coming." The group sprang into action, scavenging whatever they could find to strengthen the barricades. Miguel worked on sealing the side door, using duct tape and broken furniture to patch up the gaps. Hayes directed the effort, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Even Darren pitched in, though his grumbling didn't stop. Just as they started to feel a small sense of security, a sound pierced the air, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the halls. Everyone froze, their eyes snapping toward the direction of the solitary wing. The scream wasn't human. It was guttural, raw and filled with a rage that made the infected outside the barricade seem almost tame. "What the hell was that?" Darren whispered, his usual bravado replaced by genuine fear. Shade's jaw tightened. "Whatever it is, it's close." The group exchanged uneasy glances. The scream came again, louder this time, followed by a deafening crash. It sounded as though something or someone was tearing through the walls themselves. Hayes grabbed her baton, her knuckles white around the grip. "We need to move. Now." Before anyone could respond, the barricade at the main entrance shuddered violently. The infected outside had heard the scream, and it seemed to have sent them into a frenzy. Growls and snarls filled the air as the barricade buckled under their assault. Shade looked at the others, his voice firm. "We stick together. No one gets left behind." As the barricade began to give way, the group braced themselves for the fight of their lives, the echo of the scream still ringing in their ears. Whatever had made that sound was coming, and it was bringing hell with it. Part 1, the final stand. Action-packed moments. The cafeteria barricade shuddered under the weight of the infected, their guttural snarls reverberating through the room. The survivors had no choice. Shade barked orders as he tightened the straps on his makeshift armor, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We make for the main gate. Stick together. Keep moving. And don't stop for anything." Miguel slung a reinforced pipe over his shoulder, his face pale but determined. Hayes, despite her injured leg, gripped a baton in one hand and a riot shield in the other, her eyes steeled with resolve. Darren, as usual, lingered at the edge of the group, his smirk a thin veneer over the nervous energy radiating from him. With a final deafening crash, the barricade gave way. The infected poured into the cafeteria, their disfigured bodies moving with a feral intensity. Shade led the charge, swinging his crowbar into the first wave, creating a narrow path for the others to follow. Miguel was close behind, his pipe connecting with the skull of an infected inmate who lunged too close. Hayes brought up the rear, using her shield to push back the creatures as they swarmed. The group moved as one, each step a struggle as the infected closed in around them. The hallways were a labyrinth of chaos, broken furniture, shattered glass, and the ever-present echoes of pursuit. "We need to keep right," Miguel shouted over the din, pointing toward the corridor that led to the main gate. Shade nodded, motioning for the others to follow. They fought their way through, each corner revealing new threats. The infected were relentless, their numbers growing with every passing moment. As they reached the final stretch before the gate, their path was blocked by a large, overturned security desk. The infected were close behind, their snarls growing louder. Miguel and Hayes worked quickly to clear the obstacle, but it was Darren who moved with surprising urgency, climbing over the desk to scout ahead. "What do you see?" Hayes yelled, her voice strained as she shoved the desk aside. Darren glanced back, his expression unreadable. "Looks clear. Let's go." The group surged forward, unaware of the truth. As they approached the gate, the infected burst from the shadows, cutting off their escape route. Darren stepped back, a smirk playing on his lips. "Guess I forgot to mention. Looks like we're not the only ones trying to leave." Shade's eyes narrowed as he pieced it together. Darren had scouted ahead not to help, but to secure his own escape. He had deliberately led them into a trap, hoping to use the chaos as a distraction. "You son of a..." Miguel started, but there was no time for accusations. The infected closed in, their sheer numbers forcing the group into a desperate fight. Shade swung his crowbar with precision, his strikes fueled by a mix of anger and determination. Miguel held his ground, his pipe whistling through the air as it connected with the infected. Hayes, injured but unyielding, positioned herself in front of the group, her riot shield absorbing the brunt of the attacks. Darren, for all his scheming, found himself cornered, his bravado faltering as the infected bore down on him. He screamed for help, but the others were too consumed by their own battles to respond. In the chaos, the group began to splinter, their cohesion unraveling. Shade saw it happening and knew they wouldn't last long. He shouted above the noise, his voice cutting through the panic. "Focus! Stay together, or we're done!" His command brought a semblance of order, the survivors rallying around him. Darren, realizing his betrayal had backfired, scrambled to rejoin the group, his face pale with fear. Shade considered leaving him behind, but made a split-second decision, pulling him out of the infected's reach. "Don't make me regret this," Shade growled, his grip tight on Darren's arm. The group pushed forward with renewed determination, their weapons and willpower the only things keeping them alive. The main gate loomed ahead, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. The infected pressed in from all sides, their snarls a constant reminder of the stakes. "We're not gonna make it," Miguel shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "We don't have a choice." Shade snapped back, his crowbar slamming into another infected. "Keep moving." Part 2, the final stand. Sacrifices, heroism, and a glimmer of hope. The survivors reached the final stretch leading to the main gate, their breaths ragged and their bodies bruised. The gate, a massive steel barrier, stood partially ajar. Beyond it lay a glimpse of freedom, but the infected swarmed the perimeter, drawn by the noise and movement inside. It was their last obstacle, but also their most dangerous. Shade quickly assessed the situation, his mind racing for a solution. The infected were closing in fast, their snarls reverberating off the walls. Miguel pointed to a cluster of gas pipes running along the far wall. "If we can blow those, we might buy enough time to get through the gate." Hayes' eyes widened at the suggestion. "That'll bring the whole place down. Someone has to stay behind to set it off." "I'll do it!" Larson's voice cut through the group's panic. The guard who had quietly rejoined them after his earlier guilt-driven return stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I got us into this mess when I ran. Let me make it right." Shade started to protest, but Larson shook his head. "There's no time to argue. You need to get these people out of here. That's all that matters." Miguel hesitated, his hand clutching the map of the prison's layout. "There's a control valve. If you open it just enough, the pressure will—" "I'll figure it out," Larson interrupted with a faint smile. "Just get moving." As the group reluctantly moved toward the gate, Larson grabbed a lighter from his pocket and turned back to the gas pipes. His hands trembled as he worked, the growls of the infected growing louder. He glanced over his shoulder, watching as the others disappeared through the gap in the gate. His lips moved in a silent prayer, not for himself, but for them. When the infected broke through the final barricade, Larson lit the flame. The explosion ripped through the air, a deafening roar that sent a shockwave through the prison. Fire and debris engulfed the infected, buying the survivors precious seconds to escape. The group stumbled out into the open air, the night sky above them a stark contrast to the chaos they had just endured. The sound of the explosion still echoed in their ears, but they had no time to process the loss. The infected were still coming, pouring out of the shattered remains of the gatehouse, their relentless hunger driving them forward. Shade, battered but unwavering, took charge. "We moved to the outer wall. Stay close and keep your eyes open." As they made their way across the yard, a distant sound caught their attention, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder with each passing second. Miguel's eyes lit up with hope. "Helicopters! They're coming for us!" Spotlight swept across the prison yard as 2 helicopters hovered above the outer wall. Through the loudspeaker, a voice called out, "Survivors, move to the extraction zone." For a moment, relief washed over the group. They were so close, but the infected swarmed in greater numbers, drawn by the sound of the helicopters. The survivors fought desperately, their makeshift weapons barely holding the creatures at bay. Darren, still shaken from his earlier betrayal, fought with a newfound fervor, his strikes fueled by guilt and desperation. As the group reached the extraction point, the helicopters lowered their ladders. Hayes helped Miguel climb up, her injured leg buckling under the strain. Shade held the line, his crowbar swinging with brutal efficiency as he covered their retreat. One by one, the survivors climbed to safety, but the infected were relentless. "Shade, come on!" Miguel shouted from above, his hand outstretched. Shade hesitated, his eyes scanning the yard for any stragglers. Darren was still fighting, his back pressed against the wall as the infected closed in. Shade cursed under his breath and ran to him, his crowbar cutting through the creatures with a ferocity born of sheer will. "We go together, or not at all," Shade shouted, pulling Darren toward the ladder. As they climbed, the infected swarmed the base of the wall, their clawed hands reaching for the survivors. The helicopter's blades roared above, drowning out the snarls below. Just as Shade reached the top, an infected grabbed his leg, pulling him downward. For a moment, it seemed like he would fall, but Darren, with an unexpected burst of strength, reached down and yanked him free. The helicopter lifted off, carrying the survivors into the night. Below, Ridgeway Penitentiary burned, the flames consuming the infected and the prison alike. The survivors sat in stunned silence, their faces marked by exhaustion and loss. Miguel clutched the map to his chest, his mind already racing with thoughts of what came next. Hayes leaned back, her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face as she whispered Larson's name. Shade looked out over the horizon, the distant lights of the city, a reminder of the world they had fought so hard to return to. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was hope. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The broadcaster's voice cut in, bringing the story full circle. Tonight, Ridgeway Penitentiary fell, but from its ashes, a handful of survivors emerged. Scarred, broken, but alive. They remind us that even in the darkest moments, humanity endures. If you're out there listening, know this. The world may have changed, but as long as we stand together, we can face whatever comes next. The broadcast ended with a question. What would you do if survival meant risking everything? Would you rise, or would you fall? Share your story, because in the end, it's our stories that keep us human. The helicopter soared away from the inferno that had once been Ridgeway Penitentiary, the fiery glow fading into the darkness below. Inside, the survivors sat in heavy silence, their faces a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and grief. Every one of them bore the marks of the night, the bruises, the blood, and the haunted looks in their eyes, but they were alive. That was all that mattered. Shade leaned against the cold interior wall of the helicopter, his hand still gripping the crowbar. He stared out of the window, the distant city lights a stark reminder of the world they had fought so hard to return to. Beside him, Miguel clutched the crumpled prison map, his knuckles white as though letting go of it would erase their chance at survival. Hayes sat with her back to the cockpit, her leg bandaged but still throbbing. She closed her eyes, replaying the night. In her mind, Larson's sacrifice weighed heavily on her. The image of him standing resolutely by the gas line burned into her memory. She whispered his name under her breath, her voice cracking with the weight of guilt and gratitude. Darren, unusually quiet, stared at his hands. The smirk that had so often been his mask was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. For once, he didn't have a joke or a quip. He had nearly gotten them all killed, and he knew it. Yet Shade had pulled him out, and in the end, he had saved Shade in return. The unspoken tension between them remained, but for now, it didn't matter. As the city came into view, the group began to process what they had endured. Shade broke the silence first, his voice low but firm. "We made it, but we didn't do it alone. Larson, he gave us this chance. We owe it to him to make it count." Miguel nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. And to the others, the ones who didn't make it, we didn't just survive for ourselves. We survived for them. Hayes opened her eyes, her gaze meeting Shade's. What now? The world out there isn't the same as the one we left behind. We can't just go back to normal. Shade's jaw tightened, his grip on the crowbar firm. We don't go back, we move forward. Together, the helicopter touched down on the outskirts of the city, its rotors stirring up dust and debris. The survivors disembarked cautiously, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. A small rescue team approached, their faces tired but welcoming. "Are you the only ones?" one of them asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Shade nodded grimly. "The only ones." The survivors were escorted to a makeshift shelter, their wounds tended to as they recounted their story. The rescue team listened intently, their expressions shifting from shock to awe as the details unfolded. Ridgeway's fall was no longer just a tragedy. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Later that night, as the group sat around a dimly lit table, Hayes spoke up, her voice steady, despite the emotion behind it. "We didn't just survive Ridgeway, we survived each other. We trusted when it seemed impossible, and we fought when we had nothing left. That's what got us out. And that's what's going to keep us going." Miguel nodded, a faint smile breaking through his exhaustion. "We started as strangers, enemies even, but we're still here. That has to mean something." Shade stood, his shadow stretching across the room. "It means everything. We didn't just survive Ridgeway, we broke the chains. We proved that no matter how bad it gets, we can endure." The story of Ridgeway Penitentiary would echo far beyond its walls, carried by the survivors and those who heard their tale. Alex Reed's voice returned to the airwaves, tying the events to the broader fight for humanity. Ridgeway Penitentiary was built to lock away danger, to keep the worst of humanity behind unbreakable walls. But tonight, those walls fell, and from the chaos, survival broke free. If you've been listening, you know this isn't the end. It's only the beginning. To hear how these survivors fight for what's left of humanity, stay tuned. Like, subscribe, and join us tomorrow for the next chapter. The broadcast ended with a call to action, a challenge to the audience. What would you do if you were trapped inside Ridgeway? If every choice meant life or death, would you rise to the challenge? Share your escape plan in the comments below. Because in the end, it's not just about surviving, it's about how you choose to survive. And with that, the story of Ridgeway passed into legend, a tale of sacrifice, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the darkest hours. And if you've listened to this radio broadcast all the way to the end, thank you so much for your support. Don't forget to show your love by subscribing to our channel. Thanks again, and we'll see you tomorrow with another brand new radio broadcast. Stay safe.